August 1944. The morning sun burned over the fields of northern France like a furnace, casting long shadows across the battered landscape where war had carved its cruel signature into every hill and valley. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell stood outside his command tent, watching supply trucks roll past in an endless procession that seemed to stretch back to the beaches of Normandy themselves. He was 32 years old, lean as a whip, with dark circles under his eyes that told the story of 3 months without proper sleep. The Third Army had been bleeding fuel and ammunition for weeks now. Every mile they pushed deeper into France meant another mile between them and the supply depots on the coast. The logistics were simple and brutal, they were outrunning their own lifeline. Mitchell crushed out his cigarette and walked back into the tent where maps covered every surface. His staff officers looked up, their faces showing the same exhaustion he felt in his bones. Captain Robert Hayes, his logistics officer, was arguing with Major Thompson about fuel allocations. Hayes slammed his fist on the table. "The numbers don't lie, Major. We're burning 5,000 gallons more per day than we're receiving. At this rate, we'll be dead in the water by next Tuesday." Thompson shook his head, his jaw tight. "Then we slow down. We consolidate. We wait for the supply lines to catch up." That's when they heard the jeep outside. The engine sound was distinctive, driven hard and fast. Mitchell knew that sound. Everyone in the Third Army knew that sound. General George S. Patton burst through the tent flap like a hurricane given human form. His polished helmet gleamed despite the dust, his ivory-handled revolvers sat on his hips, and his eyes blazed with an intensity that made grown men step back. He didn't salute. He didn't need to. His presence commanded the room better than any rank insignia ever could. "Gentlemen," Patton said, his voice cutting through the space like a blade. "I understand we have a supply problem." Mitchell straightened. "Sir, we're running critically low on fuel and ammunition. Captain Hayes estimates we have 4 days of operational capacity at our current consumption rate." Patton walked to the map table, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. He stared at the colored pins showing their positions, the red lines marking enemy formations, the blue arrows indicating planned advances. His finger traced a path eastward, through 6 French cities that stood between them and the German border. 4 days, Patton repeated softly. Then his voice rose like thunder. 4 days is enough to win this war, or 4 days is enough to lose it. The question is which one we choose. Hayes cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, if we push forward without adequate supplies, we risk leaving our units stranded and vulnerable to counterattack." Patton turned, and his gaze fixed on Hayes with an intensity that could melt steel. "Captain, do you know what the Germans are doing right now? They're running. They're scattered, disorganized, and terrified. Their supply lines are shattered worse than ours. The difference is we have momentum and they have fear. Fear wins battles when you know how to use it." He swept his hand across the map. Metz, Nancy, Verdun, Reims, Chalons, Troyes. 6 cities in 72 hours. That's what I'm proposing. We take every drop of fuel we have, every round of ammunition, every ounce of guts in this army, and we drive a spear straight through the heart of their defensive line before they can recover. The tent went silent. Mitchell felt his heart hammering in his chest. What Patton was describing wasn't just aggressive. It was reckless. It was insane. It violated every principle of military logistics he'd ever learned. Thompson found his voice first. "Sir, if we commit everything to this push and it fails, we'll have nothing left for defense. We'll be completely exposed." Patton smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Major, I didn't come to France to defend. I came to attack. The Germans expect us to stop, to consolidate, to play it safe. That's what Montgomery would do. That's what Bradley thinks we should do. But safe doesn't win wars. Speed wins wars. Audacity wins wars. Surprise wins wars. He pulled out a cigar, bit off the end, and lit it with a match struck against his thumbnail. The smoke curled up toward the canvas ceiling. I'm not asking for your approval, gentlemen. I'm telling you what's going to happen. We move out at 0400 hours tomorrow. Every tank, every truck, every man who can hold a rifle. We're going to hit them so fast and so hard they won't know what century they're living in. Mitchell exchanged glances with his officers. He saw doubt. He saw fear. But he also saw something else. Excitement. The kind of wild, desperate excitement that comes when a man realizes he's about to be part of something that will either be remembered as brilliant or catastrophic. Sir, Mitchell said slowly. What do we tell the supply command? They're going to demand explanations. Patton walked to the tent entrance and looked out at the sunset painting the sky in shades of red and gold. He took a long pull on his cigar. Tell them we're going to make history. And history doesn't wait for supply requisition forms. The operations tent buzzed with frantic energy at 3 in the morning. Mitchell hadn't slept. None of them had. The scale of what Patton was demanding seemed to grow more impossible with every passing hour. Hayes stood over a makeshift desk covered in supply manifests, his hands shaking as he crossed out numbers and rewrote calculations. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. Colonel, we've stripped fuel from support vehicles, medical transports, even some of the kitchen trucks. We've consolidated ammunition from reserve units. And we're still short. We're still desperately short. How short? Mitchell asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad. Hayes looked up, his eyes bloodshot. We have enough fuel to get our armor columns maybe 2/3 of the way to the objective. After that, they'll be rolling on prayers. Ammunition is worse. Our artillery units have enough for one sustained barrage. Maybe two if we're lucky and the Germans don't fight back hard. Thompson slammed a clipboard down on the table. This is madness. We're being asked to commit professional suicide because Patton wants to add another chapter to his legend. Those are real men out there, real soldiers who are going to be left stranded in enemy territory when the tanks run dry. The tent flap opened and Brigadier General Hugh Gaffey walked in, Patton's chief of staff. His face was grim. The general wants a status update. Mitchell took a breath. Sir, we need to talk to him. The numbers don't work. We can't sustain this offensive with current supply levels. We need reinforcements from the rear, we need priority shipping, we need time. Gaffey's expression didn't change. The general is aware of the supply situation. He's ordered us to proceed anyway. Hayes stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. Then the general is ordering us to fail. I won't be part of sending men to die for nothing. I won't falsify these reports to make it look possible when it isn't. The silence that followed was crushing. Mitchell felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical force. Hayes was right. Every calculation showed they were driving toward disaster. But refusing a direct order from Patton wasn't just insubordination. It was career death. It was possibly a court-martial. Gaffey walked slowly to Hayes, his voice low and cold. Captain, you're relieved of duty. Report to the rear command for reassignment. Hayes' jaw dropped. Sir, I'm just telling you the truth. Someone has to. The truth, Gaffey said, is that this war will be won by men who have the courage to risk everything, not by accountants who hide behind numbers. Pack your gear. Mitchell watched Hayes leave the tent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The young captain had been right about everything, and it had cost him his position. Thompson looked away, clearly wrestling with whether to speak up himself. Gaffey turned to Mitchell. Colonel, you're now in charge of logistics coordination for this operation. I assume you understand what's at stake. Mitchell met his gaze. Yes, sir. Everything. Exactly. Gaffey walked to the exit. 0400 hours. Don't be late. Dawn broke over France like a crack of lightning. Mitchell stood on a hillside watching the Third Army move out, and the sight took his breath away. Tanks rolled forward in columns that stretched to the horizon, their engines roaring in a symphony of mechanical thunder. Infantry carriers followed, packed with soldiers whose faces showed equal parts determination and fear. The entire army was a river of steel and flesh flowing eastward into enemy territory. Patton stood beside him, binoculars raised, his jaw set like granite. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the general said quietly. "This is what war is supposed to look like. Not digging holes and waiting. Moving. Always moving." Mitchell wanted to argue, wanted to remind him about the fuel calculations, the ammunition shortages, the 100 ways this could go catastrophically wrong. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the sight of all those men willing to follow Patton into hell itself. Maybe it was the realization that safe meant slow, and slow meant the Germans would regroup, reinforce, and turn every city ahead into a killing ground. The radio in the command jeep crackled to life. "Sir, this is Combat Command A. We've made contact with German positions outside Metz. They're falling back. Repeat, they're falling back without significant resistance." Patton's face broke into a fierce grin. He grabbed the radio handset. "Don't let them breathe. Hit them again. Keep moving. I want Metz by nightfall." Over the next 6 hours, reports flooded in that seemed to defy logic. The German defenders were scattered, confused, retreating in disorder. The Third Army smashed through defensive positions that should have taken days to overcome. By noon, advance elements had already pushed 15 miles beyond their starting point. Mitchell stood in the command vehicle, listening to radio chatter from a dozen different units. A pattern was emerging. The Germans had been preparing for a conventional advance, a methodical push that would give them time to establish new defensive lines. Patton's reckless speed had caught them completely off guard. They were abandoning supplies, equipment, even entire ammunition depots in their rush to escape. "Colonel," Thompson said, his voice filled with something Mitchell hadn't heard in weeks, "hope. Combat Command B just captured a German fuel depot outside Nancy. Intact. They're reporting over 50,000 gallons." Mitchell felt something shift in his chest. The gamble was working. Not because the supply situation had improved, but because Patton had been right about one critical thing: the enemy was more broken than they were. He looked at Patton, who was studying maps with the intensity of a man possessed. The general glanced up, met his eyes, and nodded once. A silent acknowledgement that sometimes the difference between genius and madness is nothing more than whether you win or lose. If you're watching this and thinking about what it takes to change history, to make decisions that seem impossible, then you understand what those men felt in that moment. Subscribe to the channel because this story is just beginning, and the real twist is still ahead. By the end of the first day, the Third Army had taken 3 cities. Metz fell at dusk, its German garrison surrendering to tanks that appeared from directions they never anticipated. Nancy was captured before midnight, its bridges intact, its defenders fleeing eastward in chaos. Verdun, the fortress city that had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives in World War I, fell without a major battle. The Germans simply weren't there in strength. Mitchell worked through the night, coordinating the advance from a mobile command post that never stayed in one place for more than 2 hours. The captured fuel depots became lifelines. German supply trucks, abandoned on roadsides, were commandeered and pressed into American service. It was improvisation on a scale that would have horrified any logistics textbook, but it was working. On the second day, something remarkable happened. Word of the American advance spread through the French civilian population like wildfire. In Reims, resistance fighters emerged from hiding and seized key government buildings before the Third Army even arrived. They provided intelligence on German positions, showed American commanders secret routes through the city, and celebrated in the streets as tanks rolled past. Thompson found Mitchell in a commandeered cafe that now served as a temporary headquarters. Sir, you need to hear this. He held out a decoded German radio intercept. Their high command is in complete disarray. They're issuing contradictory orders. Some units are told to hold at all costs. Others are ordered to retreat immediately. They don't know where we are or where we're going next. Mitchell read the intercept twice. The Germans had based their entire defensive strategy on the assumption that American forces would move cautiously, that supply constraints would force periodic halts. Patton had shattered that assumption so completely that their command structure was collapsing under the weight of its own miscalculations. At dawn on the third day, Patton gathered his commanders on the outskirts of Chalons. His uniform was dusty, his face showed 3 days without proper sleep, but his eyes burned with undiminished intensity. Gentlemen, we have one city left. Troyes. And beyond Troyes, the German border. We've come further in 72 hours than anyone thought possible. But here's what they don't know yet. He pulled out a map and spread it across the hood of a jeep. We're not stopping at Troyes. We're going to keep going until we run out of road or Germans to kill. Whichever comes first. Mitchell felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just relief that the gamble had worked. It was pride. They had been part of something that would be studied in military academies for generations. Patton had changed warfare itself, proving that speed and audacity could overcome superior numbers and defensive positions. The assault on Troyes began at 1000 hours. By sunset, the city was theirs. 6 cities in 72 hours. The impossible had become reality. The command tent in Troyes felt different from every other headquarters Mitchell had occupied during the war. There was electricity in the air, a sense that they had just witnessed something that transcended ordinary military operations. Officers moved with renewed energy, their exhaustion replaced by the intoxicating realization that they had been part of history. Mitchell sat across from Patton, who was writing his report to Supreme Command. The general's hand moved across the paper with quick, decisive strokes. He looked up, catching Mitchell's gaze. You doubted me, Colonel. Don't deny it. I saw it in your eyes that first night. Mitchell didn't flinch. Yes, sir, I did. The numbers said it was impossible. Patton set down his pen and leaned back. The numbers were right. It was impossible. That's why it worked. He pulled out a cigar but didn't light it, just rolled it between his fingers. The Germans knew our supply situation as well as we did. They knew we couldn't sustain a deep offensive. So they planned accordingly. They positioned their forces to counter what was logically possible. And we did what was logically impossible. The radio operator knocked on the tent pole. Sir, message from General Bradley at Army Group Command. He wants a full explanation of how you achieved such rapid advance with limited supplies. Patton smiled, and for once it reached his eyes. Tell General Bradley that we used superior American initiative, tactical flexibility, and the kind of aggressive spirit that wins wars. And if he wants the detailed logistics report, he can ask Colonel Mitchell. After the operator left, Patton stood and walked to the map. 6 cities. 72 hours. We didn't just capture territory, Colonel. We broke their will. Every German commander from here to Berlin is going to think twice before assuming Americans will fight by the book. That's worth more than 100 cities taken slowly. Thompson entered with final casualty reports. Mitchell braced himself, expecting the numbers to reflect the recklessness of the operation. Thompson's voice was quiet. Sir, total casualties for the 3-day offensive, 214 wounded, 47 killed in action. The tent went silent. Mitchell had prepared for thousands. The speed of the advance, the deep penetration into enemy territory, the risks they'd taken, all of it should have resulted in catastrophic losses. Instead, the rapid movement had kept them ahead of German artillery, prevented the enemy from organizing effective counterattacks, and caught defenders so off guard that many surrendered rather than fight. Patton nodded slowly. Every one of those men gave everything. We honor them by making sure their sacrifice bought us something permanent. This breakthrough changes the timeline of this war. We just shortened it by months, maybe more. Mitchell felt the weight of the past 72 hours settle on his shoulders. Hayes had been right about the numbers. Thompson had been right about the risks. But Patton had been right about something deeper, something that couldn't be calculated on paper, the human element of warfare, the psychology of momentum, the power of audacity to reshape what's possible. Outside, soldiers celebrated in the streets of Troyes. They didn't know yet how close they'd come to disaster. They only knew they'd won. December 1945. West Point Military Academy. The war had been over for 7 months, and the world was learning to remember how peace felt. Colonel James Mitchell stood at a podium in front of 200 cadets, their young faces eager and attentive. Behind him, a large map showed the route of Patton's August offensive, those 6 cities marked in red, the timeline compressed into an impossible 72 hours. The question you need to ask yourselves, Mitchell said, his voice carrying through the lecture hall, is not whether General Patton's decision was reckless. It was. The question is whether recklessness has a place in military doctrine when conventional wisdom leads to predictable failure. A cadet raised his hand. Sir, did you ever speak to Captain Hayes again? The logistics officer who was relieved. Mitchell smiled. Hayes received a commendation 6 months after the operation. Patton personally requested it. The general wrote that Hayes had been completely correct in his calculations, and that his integrity in reporting the truth deserved recognition even though his conclusion had been rejected. Hayes made lieutenant colonel and served with distinction through the rest of the war. He clicked to the next slide, showing supply charts and fuel consumption rates. What we learned in those 72 hours changed military logistics forever. Speed became a supply source. Captured enemy depots became planned resources. The psychological impact of rapid advance became a force multiplier. These principles are now taught at every command school in the world. Thompson, now a brigadier general himself, sat in the back of the room. After the lecture, he approached Mitchell. You ever regret not speaking up that night? Telling Patton it couldn't be done? Mitchell looked at the map one more time. Every day. And I'm grateful I kept my mouth shut. Because Hayes was right about what we couldn't do. But Patton was right about what we had to do. Sometimes those are the same thing. They walked outside into the December snow. Patton had died exactly 1 week ago, in a car accident in Germany, never making it home to see the peace he'd helped win. The news had hit Mitchell harder than he expected. He changed warfare, Thompson said quietly. Every armor doctrine, every rapid deployment strategy, every deep penetration operation, they all trace back to those 72 hours in France. Mitchell nodded. He proved that logistics aren't just about having enough supplies. They're about having enough courage to use what you have in ways no one expects. The cadets filed out of the lecture hall, arguing about risk and reward, about when rules should be broken and when they should be sacred. Mitchell listened to them and smiled. They were learning the same lesson he had learned in that tent in August 1944, that history belongs to those willing to gamble everything on being right. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. If it moved you, if it made you think about leadership, courage, and the fine line between genius and madness, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us what historical moment you'd like to see explored next. These stories matter. These lessons endure. And we'll keep bringing them to you, one incredible chapter at a time.